Hello everyone and welcome to episode 2 of the History Hotline. Today we'll be talking about the Mangrove Nine. It's part 2. It's the protests, the trial, the aftermath and all the events that, followed on from this epic court case that we are about to discuss. So, first and foremost, just a reminder, the Mangrove Restaurant opened by Frank Critchlow in 1968 and it faced constant raids, police intimidation, in search of sex workers, in search of narcotics, drugs, and, in search of anything that could incriminate the Mangrove and Frank and his staff. They found nothing, they found no drugs, they had found no evidence of prostitution or pimps or anything else they had claimed. Now, just to remind you and to set the scene, that, in 1970 August, when they had decided to protest, of course it was because of the treatment that they had felt and witnessed at the Mangrove Restaurant. However, just like protests are happening now and have happened in the past few months, it doesn't really tend to be about just one issue, one thing that's happened. Whilst we protested for George Floyd, for Breonna Taylor, and for all the people that were, fallen victim to police brutality, that was not the only reason people, decided to come out of their house in the middle of a pandemic and protest. It was because of the years of systemic racism that they had felt. It was because they had felt maybe police brutality in England is just as a big of a problem as it is in America. Whilst police don't have guns here, there are still instances of disproportionate amounts of stop and searches for black and brown people in comparison to white people. People don't just protest because of the thing at hand. And this instant, at the Mangrove Restaurant, it was no different. It was a culmination of pressure, of discrimination, of prejudice weighing down on the shoulders of these people, and they had decided that enough was enough, and they stepped out on that day knowing full well that whilst the Mangrove was in their mind, and that was the kind of the match, it was like that was the catalyst for the protests. It was years of issues that had kind of led up to this point. And also, just to make the point that in 1970 America is well into their civil rights movement. Britain obviously is in there, and this is part of it. The Caribbean, there were problems there as well, and in Africa with colonialism and imperialism. So it was a global black power struggle. You've got people like Marcus Garvey, who was born in the earlier kind of part of the 20th century, but his impact definitely, it left a legacy of this idea that all black people of the African diaspora are in this movement together, and every fight that you do in your particular country or your particular community for black people, that is a step in the right direction for black people as a global kind of body of people. We don't often think about black people now so much as an African diaspora as kind of a one. We think of people a little bit more separately and as part of maybe one specific community or one specific nationality. But back then, I think the Black Power movement was very prevalent in the UK. And I think that was part of, the reason for the protest as well. So on the 9th of August 1970, it was a Sunday, the crowd gathered just after lunchtime outside the Mangrove Restaurant in order to, begin their protest. There wasn't a pre-planned concrete route, but they did intend to go past police stations in the area to make their presence known and make sure that the police knew that they were protesting against the treatment that they had dished out. They were shouting things like, "This is the time, Black Unity now, hands off us pigs, and hands off our mangrove." And Barbara Beese, one of the women that was part of the Mangrove Nine and a protester on the day, she had a pig's head on a stick, like on a stake, and she was marching with that and holding it aloft, during the march. Darcus Howe, a community rights activist and leader, and another one of the Mangrove Nine who was there on the day, he stood on the roof of a car to give a speech, and as he spoke, about a dozen police officers apparently appeared from around the corner. Darcus pointed at them and the crowd started shouting, "Pigs, pigs, pigs." this was clearly about the police, and the protesters wanted to make sure that was known. So as I said, the object of the demonstration was to visit every police station in the area. So me not knowing Notting Hill that well, they did start, I think Nottingdale station was the first station that they got to, and police had surrounded the building. It was as if they knew that they were going there. They were ready. They were posted up on the block, waiting for these protesters. The next station they went to was Notting Hill station, and I think it was a similar scene there. And the kind of issue that we have right now and right here, as I try and narrate the events of this protest, is the fact that there's a lot of contradictory evidence. And you'd think, this is completely normal. Of course there might be contradictory evidence, from the police and the protesters. Maybe both of them, are seeing things in a different way, and would have different stories. But no, the contradictory statements are from the police officers. Police officers were saying different things. Their stories did not add up, even though they were all at the same march. Which is where we start to kind of understand the fact that this protest, this whole trial, this whole situation, it was not as black and white as a protest, that ended up in a little bit of violence and went to trial. I think there's a more sinister agenda at play in this protest, and we're going to get into that now. In order to create this podcast and to explain about the Mangrove Nine, I rely on archival material. And in this case, it was police reports and, eyewitness statements and some of the information that was gleaned from the trial, from the protesters and the accused, and also interviews done many years later, because obviously this was 50 years ago. So in between kind of then and now the fact that, the Mangrove Nine is a landmark case, oral history interviews have been done and conducted with the Mangrove Nine and their families. So that is kind of all the information collated together. So some of this information is being, regurgitated or remembered from, 20, 30, 40 years on. And some of it was maybe the days after or months after. And so there are discrepancies, and everything that I do say in the kind of next few minutes about the actual protest, none of it can be kind of taken as gospel honest truth, because it is taken from a wide range of sources. But I'm just going to explain anyway what happened. So, apparently, the officers were unsure of where the protesters planned to go. But police logs give minute-by-minute accounts of the march, because obviously there were so many police officers there that, they were able to really kind of pin down every single minute of this protest. They had enough eyes on the ground. So an officer saw a Volkswagen van, and he believed it was loaded with eggs. I'm not sure how he believed that or how he knew that, how he knew there were eggs in the van, unless the van was open. But then it would say he saw eggs, but he believed it was loaded with eggs, which could be used by the protesters. So that happened. And most reports say that at Portnall Road, things started to get a bit nasty. That's when things kind of erupted. And this is kind of corroborated by protesters and the police. So I would take this as somewhat truthful. So around 4:40, the procession stops, and within a few minutes, there's serious fighting. It all erupts, it all kicks off, everything's going on Portnall Road and on the neighbouring streets. And at that point, officers called for assistance and ambulances. That, again, we can take as fact, because that would have been recorded, by the time logs that would have said an ambulance was called at so-and-so hours and assistance and backup was called at this time. So that's kind of, something that we can believe. Now, this is where it gets a bit, he said, she said. So apparently, a police officer pulled down a placard from a protester, pinned a guy on the ground, and that's when the trouble started. The police, they said that protesters were throwing bricks from a builder's skip, and then disorder erupted. An elderly woman watching from her window said that the riot started when a bottle was thrown at a policeman, and that the police didn't interfere until that point. Another witness said that the misunderstanding was on both sides. Police stopped the procession to let a car cross, And he said at that point, really quickly, the protest seemed to lose control, and things went crazy. At about 4:56, apparently, the protesters headed back to the Mangrove restaurant, but scuffles continued for another 20 minutes. So 16 minutes after the initial kind of eruption of so-called violence, some protesters headed back to the Mangrove restaurant. Obviously, they weren't that far, but there were scuffles. Now, this is where it gets a bit interesting. So, there is evidence to state on that day the CID Special Branch were on the march, and the Special Branch are a branch of special police officers. They were on the march from the beginning, taking pictures, and those pictures were used to make the arrests. So, the police had planted special branch officers within the protesters in plain clothes to take photos of the protesters from the beginning. Now, why would you do that if you assumed that this protest would be a peaceful protest with only 100 or so protesters protesting police ill treatment? In my opinion, my small personal opinion, it's very clear to me that there is something more sinister at play. Because if you're planting police officers with cameras in a group of protesters to take photos, you are clearly expectant and hoping for something to happen that can be photographed. Because you're not just putting these police officers with their cameras in to get some cute pics. That was not the motive. So personally speaking, and you may agree, you may not, I would say that the fact that police officers were planted and they weren't, in uniform, because if they were in uniform, then everybody would know that they're police officers and they're taking pictures. Might want to cover their face. But they were not. They were planted in plain clothes so that they would not arouse suspicion, and they were taking pictures. Now, it's also made available to the public very much later on. The Home Office commissioned a report from Community Relations Commission, and they concluded that contrary to police reports, the violence was not initiated by the marchers, but the police. So, got two reports here that have come out a long time after the Mangrove protests and the trial and everything, to say that there's police officers there taking pictures, hidden, and also that the police initiated the violence on the marchers. So, in my personal opinion, once again, just me, just thinking out loud here, the fact that these things coincided and the fact that it was all on camera, a group of black people fighting police officers, being physical, whether, they started it or not, which they didn't, and then all of this eventually ends up, on newspapers in Yorkshire, in Manchester, all across the country. To me, it clearly shows that an agenda to be pushed, and that agenda was the fact that the powers that be wanted to paint black people at that time as violent, as criminals, in order to justify immigration controls that were slowly being brought in. In 1968, there was an Immigration Act passed because a lot of Asians, Indians in particular, were arriving in Britain from Kenya and Uganda as British citizens again, because they feared discrimination from the governments in Kenya and Uganda specifically. So in 1968, the British government passed legislation in 3 days. They passed it as an emergency piece of legislation to control immigration, so that only certain people would qualify as British citizens. They moved the goalposts just like they always do. And that was in 1968. So the fact that England is clearly fed up of immigrants. Enoch Powell, in the same year, has made his Rivers of Blood speech, where he plays on this kind of idea of white fear, this idea that the country is going to be overrun, your neighbours won't look like you, they won't cook food like you, they won't smell like you, they won't act like you, and it's going to create lots of racial issues, and the country's going to be just like America, who are obviously fighting a civil rights, movement at the time. If you've ever listened to his speech or read it, you'll understand the language he used. It was fear-mongering, it was hyperbolic, it was heavily symbolic language to highlight this kind of white fear. He says, oh, I was speaking to this lady and she's worried about this, or I was speaking to this man and he's worried about this. He never kind of uses his own opinions. He's very clever about that. It's a horrible speech, but that happened, and that he was supported because his ideas at that time were supported by a lot of British society. In 1967, a year before that, the National Front was formed, the far-right group that was responsible for targeting black people, beating them up in the streets. That's formed the year before that. This anti-immigrant feeling is very, very strong in Britain at this time. And if, this country can paint immigrants to be a negative thing for the country, to be the fact that, black and brown people are criminals, they're here to beat up the police, they're here to have, restaurants that are selling drugs, and this kind of idea that immigrants are a negative thing and that these people have no right to be in Britain. That is my personal opinion of what was trying to be pushed out and to be put into the media. The fact that there were photographers there ready to take pictures of what was about to happen, which the protesters had no intention of it turning violent. I think that says a lot. This attack was launched and blown out of proportion, and I think it was to justify the treatment of black people. They wanted to justify the kind of countless raids and attacks on the Mangrove. They wanted to justify controlling immigration, and they used state-sanctioned violence to do that. They wanted to destroy part of the black community, the Mangrove. They wanted to break it down, and so by locking up kind of the people that were responsible for things like restaurants and spaces for communities to come together and protest for better treatment in this country, this is how they did it. They went for the roots. They kind of hit at the roots of this tree of activism, we can call it, in order to stop it from growing. Moving on to the trial and the charges that were brought against the Mangrove Nine. So, the charges were inciting a riot. All 9 defendants were charged with that. Affray, possession of an offensive weapon, actual bodily harm to a policeman, and grievous bodily harm to a policeman. Now, those charges weren't all kind of given to all defendants. They were kind of, most of them had like a kind of a sample of all of them. It was interesting to me that Barbara Beese and Althea Jones-LeCointe, the only 2 women in the Mangrove Nine, they were both actually charged with actual bodily harm to a policeman. And it's interesting because Barbara Beese, as I mentioned before, was the one holding the pig's head and shouting and walking with that. And for her to be charged with, actual bodily harm to a policeman is quite an interesting one to me. So people were not arrested immediately after the protest. It was up to 9 weeks. It took 9 weeks to arrest some people. I think they needed to develop the photographs that their little undercover police officers had taken and then find them. So they had arrested 9 people in the weeks after 9 people, and it took 9 weeks. And it went to magistrates court in Marylebone police station. And the magistrates threw out the charges of inciting a riot. He threw them all out due to lack of evidence, because apparently the police evidence was contradictory. 23 pages of police statements were ruled to be inadmissible by the magistrate. A senior officer had said that violence was spontaneous. Others claimed that it was started by the defendants, which we now know was not the case. And if the defendants had started the violence, then yes, they would have been found guilty, or they would have been guilty of inciting a riot, but they were not. So the magistrates threw out the charges because he said that 23 pages of police statements were inadmissible because they were so contradictory. Now, to me, if you have police officers that are all at the same protest, all at the same march, there's absolutely no reason why any of their statements should be contradictory, unless one of them maybe was blind or struggling to see or missed a bit. There's no reason, if you're all in the same place, you should be telling the same story, unless it's obviously not true. Anyway, according to a Sunday Times report from an early 1971, which was a central point to the police prosecution case, was this idea that the banners and the chants were "kill the pigs." And obviously Barbara Beese had a pig's head, and they were shouting "pigs, pigs, pigs" at police officers, And that was the kind of slogan that was used in America during the kind of protests there and the anti-police kind of movement. And apparently these were taken as words of evidence to kind of incite violence onto police officers. But the magistrate disagreed with that statement. I think it's also important to note that Black Power from America, it was slowly coming into Britain. Malcolm X had visited Britain a few years before this. Stokely Carmichael, leader of the Black Panthers, had also visited Britain. He'd also been, what's the word? He wasn't allowed to come back. He wasn't allowed to make his speech, and he wasn't allowed to stay. British people were absolutely petrified of Black Power. I think they might have even been more afraid of Black Power than white Americans were. Because they didn't really understand it, and they didn't really understand, what Black people had to kind of complain about, in a sense. So this magistrate has thrown out these charges of inciting a riot. However, the other charges were brought to the Old Bailey, and the defendants obviously were not just charged with inciting a riot, they were charged with the other things I mentioned before, and the charge of riot was reintroduced. The High Court overruled the Magistrates' Court. The magistrates threw it out. He said it's not happening. And the High Court brought it back because the prosecution pushed for it, and the High Court can overrule a Magistrates' Court by British law, and no reason is needed for them to do so. So they did it. And the defendants were rearrested on the charge of inciting a riot. So from having the case thrown out to now it's been brought back and it's been taken up by the High Court. So this is a case that obviously would have gone to Magistrates' Court, but the magistrate said, nah, it's all right. It's not that serious. She didn't do it. And now the High Court has taken it up, and the High Court is obviously, more serious. It's going to carry a higher penalty if you're found guilty in a High Court. I think the Magistrate Court can only give out a certain sentence. Don't quote me on that. That might be a complete lie. I don't know. But it's obviously more serious because it's been taken to a High Court. And this is where I think you can kind of see this strategy to make an example of these people and to target and discredit them as leaders. Now, it is quite interesting to note that of the 9 people in there, I think pretty much all of them were big in their community for activism and for movements of Black Power. Althea Jones-LeCointe and Barbara Beese are Black Panthers, same as Darcus Howe. They're in the British Black Panther movement, and they are leaders in it as well. So the kind of, powers that be, they've kind of struck gold. They have got these, big names in the Black community. They've got them on charges. They can shut them up. They can send them away for as long as they want. All they have to do is prove that they are guilty of these crimes. And don't you think as well, it's interesting for me personally, of the 150 people that were protesting, they managed to pick out, some of the biggest names in the activist community of the 150 people. Now, obviously, Barbara Beese is holding a pig's head and Darcus Howe is standing on cars giving speeches. So, they would be easy to pick out. But all of them were not, so vocal in the protests. But it's very interesting that they managed to find these exact people. And Frank Critchlow as well, owner of the restaurant, he's picked up as well. So, the trial. One of the longest trials in legal British history. It was 9 weeks long. The Black community showed up and showed out. They followed them, they supported them, they turned up at court, there was banners of support, they gave legal support. And it was a real kind of community effort with this whole process. Obviously, there were 9 people being accused, but the Black community really got behind them at this point. I would love to go into kind of every single one of the Mangrove Nine and tell you about who they were and what they were doing, but I don't want this podcast to be, so long. And I do think I will revisit these individuals because, their lives weren't just limited to what they achieved in this kind of Mangrove Nine situation. There was more to them all as individuals, so we might revisit them. Please let me know if you'd like that. Let me know in the comments below. But I will tell you about Barbara and Althea because I am interested in, the history of women, especially when it comes to activism, because most leaders within Black movements, Black Power movements are men. The kind of standout names tend to be male. So I'll tell you a little bit about Barbara and Althea. Barbara was 20 years old at the time this was happening, and Althea was 25. Barbara said that, the atmosphere of the courtroom was, she said, male, pale and stale, and it was very intimidating. And it was the fact that they were taken to the Old Bailey where the worst criminals went on trial. She said, for us to be here, it was like we were being told we were up there with the murderers and the rapists for a charge that was thrown out by magistrates. It was clearly going to be a show, and it was set up to be a show. Barbara's 20 years old. That's like, when you think about how young that is to be on trial at the Old Bailey for something that you didn't even do, it's absolutely petrifying. Althea Jones-LeCointe, she's 25 years old. She just graduated with a PhD in biochemistry from UCL, which is the whole reason she came to England in the first place. She came as a student. She's a leading figure in the Black Panther Party, and I should be calling her Dr. Althea, actually. Excuse me, Dr. Althea. And she fought for black women and girls within the Black Panther Party because if you know anything about the Black Panthers, they're not really an anti-sexist movement, let's say. They're very good with the black power, but they forget that, the patriarchy does not help black women, and that's both in America and Britain. And Althea really kind of tried to subvert that, working with black women and black girls within the Black Panther Party and the movement. Barbara Beast at the time, she's recently had a baby, and the baby was only about 1 or 2 years old, and the father is Darcus Howe, the man that was standing on the car during the protests and also accused. So she was absolutely petrified that, if her and Darcus get sentenced, who's going to look after this baby? Barbara grew up in the care system, and did not have a good time in that kind of care system, and did not want the same thing for her son. Funnily enough, just since we're talking about her son actually ended up as the president and chief CEO of Island Records, and he signed Amy Winehouse and Jessie J, and he's now the president of Island Records in New York. His name is Darcus Beast, and he's like a really big name in the music industry now. And I kind of mentioned that because he's still alive and well. Barbara and Dr. Althea, they're still alive as well. This history is not a history of long ago. This happened 50 years ago. That happened in my parents' lifetime, definitely your grandparents' lifetime. And the fact that, these things are so prominent then, and it feels like they are still happening now, it worries me about how little has happened in 50 years. But also the fact that this history is very recent. And so if we're waiting on, attitudes and mindsets to change, it's not really going to be the case, because there are people that are still alive, that were alive then, that still probably hold those attitudes and ideas and are, injecting those into the younger generations. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting to bring that to light. Anyway, back to the trial. So we've got 9 defendants, 7 of them represented by legal counsel, which means they had lawyers that were going to be, representing them in court, in the High Court. They had a bit of a struggle to find, adequate lawyers, because I think there was one situation, I can't remember with who, but he said that he went into a lawyer's office, he explained the situation, the lawyer said, oh, you know what, just plead guilty to the charges, you'll be, out by 5 years, you can be back with your wife, there's no need to go through all this trial. And he knew, as an innocent man, that is exactly what he was not going to do, and walk straight out of the room without even engaging in conversation with such a ludicrous idea, which, don't get me wrong, it's ludicrous when we think about it, because we know he's an innocent man. However, a lawyer at the time, knowing the case, knowing the fact that he's black, knowing the fact that he's up against a all-white society in some ways, and against the police, he obviously advised him in the way he thought fit, but thankfully he did not take that advice. 2 of the defendants decided to defend themselves, which is where it gets very juicy and very interesting. It was very typical of Black Panthers in America to defend themselves. It had been done before. Trials in America, as you know, are always, they've got a little bit more drama, a little bit more edge than a British trial, which are a little bit more stiff. But in America, the Black Panther trials were always full of drama. I think it was Bobby Seale. He was gagged and chained up in a trial by a judge because he kept hurling verbal abuse at the judge. And obviously that's absolutely crazy. And if you ever look at the court drawn art of that, you'll understand just how kind of disgusting that is, to be gagging a human being in a court of law. Don't get me wrong, this Mangrove trial was not that dramatic at all. However, they had adopted these tactics from the best, from the best of the best when it came to defending themselves from crooked police and institutional racism. So Althea Jones LeCointe and Darcus Howe, they were the two that were representing themselves, both, as I said before, members of the Black Panther Party in Britain. So it gave them the ability to speak directly to the jury. It was a big political move. It meant that they didn't have to go through barristers because a lot of them didn't feel like they could trust them. As I said, barristers said that they should plead guilty in the past, etc., etc. They knew that it wasn't going to be a fair trial. It's a group of black people against the police. It would never, be fair. No one was playing fair at this point, and they knew that. They knew they'd started off playing dirty, so why would they play fair now? However, they decided that, they were quite hopeful in the idea that maybe if an all-black jury was selected, it would level the playing field, and that is why they defended themselves and pushed for an all-black jury. They cited, the Magna Carta, which states that you should have a jury of peers to try you if you are accused in a court of law, and that for them, obviously, as black people, meant a jury of black people. Obviously, the judge rejected that and said that's not happening. You're not having a jury of all black people. Instead, they had to create a selection criteria for the jury, which is common in all trials. There's always a selection criteria depending on the case. And for this selection criteria, they decided that it would be, what do you understand by the term black power? And as I said to you before, British people were very afraid of black power. They didn't know what it meant, and it's probably the main reason for their fear and their prejudice. In total, based on that one question, they rejected 63 potential jurors. And in the end of the trial, in the end of the selection process, they ended up with a jury of 2 black members, and the rest were white, but obviously had satisfied their answer in the question of what do you understand by the term black power. By choosing to represent themselves, it obviously meant that they could, manoeuvre a jury that they wanted, but also the idea of black people in Britain in the 1970s defending themselves in a court of law really increased media attention, and this is exactly what, the Black Panthers in America would do. It garners attention, it garners an audience, and you can push a political message if you have an audience, and so this is exactly what was done, and the courtrooms were packed every single day of the trial. There was a man called Farouk Dondi, who was a new recruit for the Panthers, who came into court and took notes every day. And he said Darcus was very theatrical, showed off like hell. He said whenever Althea spoke, you could hear a pin drop in the court. Now, this is a packed out courtroom. You've got Darcus, who's playing up to this courtroom etiquette. He's going for it. He's showing off. He's literally performing. He is shining, and Althea is captivating the audience. I say audience, I mean the courtroom, and you can literally hear a pin drop in a packed out courtroom. A lot of people really are inspired by the way Darcus Howe speaks. I am one of those people, and people would flood the courtrooms just to hear him and his kind of presentation of himself in the courtroom. He is a very inspiring speaker. If you ever had to have time, just Google him and the BBC reporter, and just have a look at that exchange if you want somewhere to start. He's incredible, and he definitely used the opportunity to perform in the courtroom. The trial went on. It went on and on and on until December 16th, 1971. And remember, this whole story began in 1968 when Frank Critchlow opened his restaurant. I'm sure he didn't think that when he opened his restaurant to sell West Indian food to West Indian people and anyone else that wanted to enjoy, he'd end up, in a court case that went on for 9 weeks, trying to fight for his right to stay out of prison. Anyway, all defendants were acquitted of the main charge of incitement to riot. Happy days. 5 were acquitted of all the charges. However, Rupert Boyce, Rodan Gordon, Anthony Innes and Althea Jones LeCointe received suspended sentences for a selection of lesser offences. And the best part of the trial, this is the moment I've been building up to. These 2 episodes culminate here, where I tell you the Judge Edward Clarke's closing comments that left a lasting mark on British society forever. He said, "What this trial has shown is that there is clearly evidence of racial hatred on both sides." He said what? He said, "This trial has shown that there is clearly evidence of racial hatred on both sides." So, let's break that down. There's 2 parts to this. So, there's the idea that the defendants have got racial hatred towards the police. Well, what can be expected? You've been brutalising them, you've been raiding their Mangrove restaurant. In any situation, I'm sure, police or not, there would be hatred towards whoever was doing that to you. Obviously, in this case, it was the police and what they represented at the time, which is oppression. But the idea that the police had shown racial hatred, the police that are meant to protect society, the police paid for by taxpayers, the police were fuming. The Metropolitan Police were absolutely fuming. Senior officers tried to get the judge to retract his statement and his comments many times and failed. He obviously, he said, "I said what I said," and he was not taking it back. A senior detective wrote about the case and he said all the police officers who gave evidence were at great pains to explain that they felt no personal antagonism towards black people within our community. And I pulled that out because I think it's very important. It speaks on this idea where, there's an incidence of clear wrongdoing at the hands of the police, and then they say, yes, but, our police officers aren't racist. They don't feel any they have no personal problems with black people or people of colour. But it's clear that even if maybe as an individual officer walking down the street as John or as James or as Bill or as Harry, they have no bias towards black people. When they put on that uniform, something's clearly switching. When they get into a group of several officers and have to police black people, there is clearly a prejudice at play, because they would not be treating them in the way that they are. Another point to draw out is the fact that, these officers that were questioned directly, they stated that they had personal views against certain individuals that were tried. So they basically said that they had a problem with some of the people, that were on trial. So whilst, they were at one point arguing that they felt no personal antagonism towards black people in the community, they had a personal issue with some of the black people in the community. Make it make sense, police officers. Now, it would be really easy to kind of wrap this story up here and say that, things changed. The judge said that, there was racial hatred. And so as a consequence of that, the police took on adequate training to address their racial bias that they had towards black people. Obviously, this did not happen because, we fast forward to 1999 with the Macpherson report that, labels the Metropolitan Police institutionally racist in the wake of the Stephen Lawrence murder and the police cover-up after it. The fact that, nothing had changed in the 27 years post-Mangrove. And now where we have disproportionate amounts of stop and searches of black and brown people in this country, and a Metropolitan Police Commissioner who doesn't really seem to understand what institutional racism is, because she keeps denying it when it's clearly a thing. There's also a personal cost on each of these people, and whilst we see the Mangrove Nine now as a representation of people standing up for their rights, doing whatever they can to prove their innocence, and stand up for the black community, there is a personal cost to that. And I want to speak on Rothwell Kentish's story. It's often forgotten when we talk about the Mangrove Nine, but he faced a separate prosecution. He was rearrested in October 1970 in relation to the violence on Portnall Road. And he was charged with attempted murder of a police officer, and he was sentenced to 36 months for assault and also for possession of an offensive weapon. Now, obviously, we're celebrating the fact that the judge has acknowledged that there is, racism at play, but this man has actually faced prison for something that he didn't do. So, in an interview with his son after Rothwell's death last year in 2019, he said that even on his deathbed with dementia, all he spoke about was the second trial. And he kept asking the family to find the court papers, even though literally he was on his deathbed and dying. He just wanted those court papers. He just wanted to talk about that trial like he couldn't understand it. It's kind of said that he bore the heaviest personal cost of the trial. And the craziest thing about it is the fact that Rothwell Kentish might not have been at the march because he was said to have been fixing a car elsewhere in London. It was the fact that he was a community leader, and it was assumed that he had to have been there at the march and so was arrested by association, even though he may not have actually even been there on the day. It will be interesting maybe to come back to some of these individuals within the Mangrove Nine and do episodes on them as individuals. Please let me know if you'd like that, or if you've had enough of them and you want to learn about some different people, different time periods, or different things. What we have here is, in this Mangrove Nine situation, the state wanting to make an example out of the mangrove and prevent the growth of organised resistance within the black community and knock that spirit of rebellion out of them. Unfortunately, it didn't work because of, in part, the judge's closing remarks and the fact that, the individuals that were charged and the way they conducted themselves in trial. It was very difficult for them to do that. They wanted to smash up the roots of an organisation before it could take root in the community. Black power, black pride was weaponised, and it was perceived to be a threat by the British state, and it didn't fall in line with the ideas that were being pushed about black people at the time. The mangrove stayed open until 1992. Frank Critchlow unfortunately passed away in 2010. Darcus Howe passed away in 2017, and Rothwell Kentish passed away last year. I know that Barbara Beese and Althea Jones-LeCointe are still alive. I'm not sure about the rest of them. I really did try and find out some information, but they're really difficult to find information about. A lot of their children have kind of taken on the kind of activist role and speak on their behalf sometimes, especially with Darcus Howe, Frank Critchlow and Rothwell Kentish, because obviously they've passed away. But these people they're not the celebrities you would assume that they should be. They're not the famous names. They're not household names. Before knowing about the Mangrove Nine, I didn't know about these people, apart from Darcus Howe, just because of his other activist work. But it's really difficult to find information about them because nobody really cared about them after this kind of case was all done and dusted and wrapped up. It's only now that we're uncovering these histories and kind of bringing their names to life and honouring them in the way that they should have been honoured at the time. Thank you so much for listening. That is all I have to say on the mangrove situation. I don't think there are any more words I have that could possibly come out. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. Next episode will be out next week, Monday. I'm not sure what it's going to be about yet, but if you have any suggestions, please do let me know on Instagram or on Twitter, because we have a Twitter page now. And thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a beautiful day. Bye bye.